Don't trip, you know? I know things is hard right now. You looking for a job. You out there hustling. Money gonna come your way, just don't trip. Gotta keep your shoes tied.
So this is part 6 of the Russell Poole theory. And now we're going to talk about the nature of cops. Cops don't like to investigate other cops because their lives depend upon their fellow officers. And so they feel that, and I think rightly so, that if their life is going to depend upon their fellow officer, that nobody's perfect, and they need to give a pass to their fellow officers if mistakes are made. And that makes sense for the most part. But when we start getting into egregious crimes like robbing a bank at gunpoint, or stealing evidence out of evidence lockers, or dealing drugs, or committing murders, I mean, clearly there has to be some kind of a balance here. But cops don't like to investigate other cops. And cops don't like internal affairs people investigating them at all. And so there's this code, and it's almost like a gang code of no snitching. And cops don't snitch on each other for the most part. But there's another part about cops. They really don't like to have guns pointed at them. They don't like people who pull the trigger and shoot other cops. And so there's another code about cops. And there's a wet blanket that gets thrown over an inmate, and a punching festival that goes on in jail sometimes when a cop killer comes into a jail or a prison, because cops don't like people who point guns at them. They want to make an example of it. There's a case where I was sent all the case files, and cops that didn't have to lie about this kid who actually had a gun and he wanted to kill himself, and he held it and he shot it up in the air and what have you. They turned it into this whole thing where he had pointed the gun at them, and no other eyewitnesses said that, but the cops all said it. And why? Because they wanted to make sure they got a really harsh sentence and a really strong conviction. And so they lied about this kid who was really just trying to commit suicide, and he wanted to commit suicide by cop. And he didn't point the gun at them, and no eyewitness said that he did, but the cops lied. And so they don't like people who are labeled as cop killers. And I think also for good reason. You know, who would want to have a bunch of people out on the streets that point guns at them, and their job is to protect and serve, and they can't administer lethal force because, you know, and they don't know who these people are. They could be popping up anywhere that might point guns at them. So they really want to call our herd of anybody that would point a gun at a cop. And here you have Tupac, who is labeled a cop killer. He's labeled a cop killer because of the Texas DPS officer that pulls over somebody who's listening to Tupac's lyrics when he gets shot, and they use the whole Tupac lyric defense. That labels him a cop killer. That gets the Dan Quayle thing, where Dan Quayle is saying there's no place for these lyrics in our society, and it calls out Tupac publicly. But then Tupac does one more thing. He shoots 2 off-duty Atlanta police officers, and Tupac gets labeled a cop killer. There's a big Globe article where Madonna is dating Tupac, and it says Madonna dating cop killer. And so Tupac is marked as a cop killer. Well, now Tupac is coming onto Death Row Records, which is the cop label. And Tupac gets a very cold shoulder from the cops when he shows up at Death Row Records. They're all nice to him, but none of them will bodyguard for him. And who does Tupac get for his bodyguards? He gets Michael Moore, a fireman. He gets Frank Alexander, a bodybuilder. And he gets Kevin Hackey, a Compton School police officer. And so these are basically Tupac's bodyguards. All of the other people, the Kevin Gaines and the Rafael Perez, David Mack, they won't guard for him. And there's a number of other police officers that just refuse to bodyguard for Tupac. And so Tupac is in a very hostile environment at this time at Death Row Records. And he cozies up with Suge, and there's a deepening between the camps at Death Row Records. You have Snoop and his crew on one side, and you have Suge and his crew on the other side, and there's this gulf that's really between them at Death Row Records. And this is the environment in which Tupac is there. And now, what do we have? We have Snoop's murder trial, and there's some real shenanigans that get pulled at this murder trial. There's all kinds of catering that happens that Suge pays for at the murder trial. And so the jurors all get to come out and have meals on Suge and on Death Row Records. And so there's this cozy thing that happens with the jurors in that trial. The jurors all, after the verdict, come and hang out at Monty's Steakhouse. And this is very irregular for a situation like this. But David Kenner was very confident going into this trial because the evidence had been destroyed, and he was able to put that into the prosecutor's face. He was able to really embarrass them and to embarrass LAPD that this evidence was missing. And he had those guys looking for days through all of the evidence lockers trying to find this evidence, trying to find where this had been misplaced, looking in evidence lockers to try and find this evidence that had been misplaced. But it hadn't been misplaced, it had been stolen. And so they tore apart their evidence lockers looking for it, and they couldn't find it. And it caused all kinds of security protocols to happen at the LAPD. And now Tupac is at the record label. The trial happens, the verdict happens, the party happens after, and everybody at Death Row Records is one big happy family for the night. But it's all about to change. It's all about to get brutal. And now we have the entire crew that worked so hard on the murder trial. They have idle hands. They need to plan their next score. And what's their next score? It's Death Row Records. You have Kevin Gaines pissed off at Suge Knight. You have Sharitha Knight pissed off at Suge Knight. You have David Kenner, who heard Lydia Harris was on the other end of the phone call. He heard Suge Knight disparaging him, pissed off at Suge Knight. And you have Snoop and Tupac, and they have a big, huge rift that's happening. And now the planning begins for how they're going to topple Suge Knight and take over Death Row Records. More later.
What you do to make money just to pay your bills? It's messed up, they don't want to see us going forward. Making sure I hold down the last name doors. It's been wild like a wild force, but I bet God got something better for us. We just gotta get together. Unity is everything. To my people, man, struggle been real too long. Our OGs been doing, so it's time for us to make a change. And I promise I'm not gonna die until I change this. I got a baby girl in this world, so I ain't got no choice. Y'all either gonna take me out or ride with me, and I put that on everything.